All right, today we're doing an in-depth look at the new Honolulu foam core paddles. In my opinion, these are some of the most well-rounded paddles that money can buy in 2025. But if you're a consumer looking at their website, it can be extremely overwhelming trying to decipher which one you should buy. So today we're gonna break down what's important, what's fluff, and hopefully help you make a smarter purchase. Honolulu has introduced 4 new foam core paddles, and there's a lot of overlap between each of them. They could have launched just one of these and been completely fine, and I think by launching all 4, it only contributes to making your decision harder as to which one you should choose. Thankfully for you, I think no matter which one you end up picking, you're going to end up with a good paddle. The differences are all very minor, and it really just comes down to how you want the paddle to feel when you hit the ball. There isn't a large variance in hand speed, sweet spot size, or even power. Honolulu's method of product launch has always been to throw everything at the wall, and whatever people buy, that's what they're going to double down on. Clearly it works in some ways, but in other ways, I think it's far too confusing. For example, I'm just going to name a few of the models that they sell on their website. You have the J2NFT, the J2NFK, the J2NF, J2FC+, J2K, J2K+, J2TI, J2TI+, J2H+, J2K Pro, J2XK Pro, and that might only be half of the paddles that are on their website. So good luck figuring out what any of those are if you're brand new to this. To help you better understand their naming scheme for the new paddles, the J plus number is the shape of the paddle. So J2 is the hybrid shape that they sell. J7 would be the elongated, and J3 is the wide body. Next, at least for the foam core models, the NF in each model stands for notched foam. And I'll explain this more in just a second. And then finally, the last letter is the facing material that they used for the paddle. So the K in NFK would be Kevlar, and then the T in NFT would be titanium, even though it isn't using actual titanium in the paddles. Then the last paddle we have is the FC+. The FC stands for foam core, and I believe the plus is what Honolulu uses to denote that it has a Gen 3 style foam ring around the edges. But honestly, guys, even just from me breaking that down for you can see that this is pretty convoluted. Honolulu would benefit significantly from reducing their catalog and simplifying their naming scheme. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about the builds of these new paddles. There's effectively only 2 different designs going on internally. You have the notched foam line, which is a full EPP core in the center, and then around the edges is another foam ring that locks into the core like little gears. Then the FC Plus is very similar. It's an EPP core center and then has a Gen 3 style ring around the edges of the paddle. This is very similar to other Gen 3 paddles that we've seen on the market. To be honest, in terms of performance, I don't think that there's a big difference between the notched foam construction and the regular Gen 3 style ring. You'll hear soon why I think the FC Plus and J2NF play very similar, and that's even with them having different face layups. So outside of the NF core design looking cooler in an X-ray, I don't know that there's a huge performance benefit. Perhaps there could be benefits outside of performance, maybe related to durability, but that's not clear at all at this point, so I don't think we can really claim that. Now let's get into the specs of these paddles. The price of the new foam core models are $195, and if you use code PBStudio, you can save 10% and drop the price to $175. As always, if you want the full specs, you can read those on screen now, but there are only a few pieces that people need to really be aware of. Honolulu's J2 hybrid shape has some of the best on-paper specs. They have low swing weights in the 107 to 112 range, and they have very high twist weights for better stability. They've pretty much always had the most stable playing hybrid on the market. The main issue is that the handle, although advertised as 5.5 inches, does not play like 5.5 inches at all. In fact, I would say it plays a lot closer to 5.25 inches, and if you have a two-handed backhand, it can feel very cramped. They are releasing a longer handle version of the FC Plus and NF in August, which is meant to address this complaint, but we don't have one yet. But as soon as we get one of those, we'll make sure to make a video on it. Finally, they're also offering a full 1-year warranty on their foam core paddles, which is great to see. I think one of the things that contributes to these paddles being so good is that the specs allow you to customize them heavily, but they also play great out of the box, so you really don't have to customize them unless you want to. I ended up trying 2 different weight setups. The first one was 3 grams near the head, just below the top corners, which is what I ended up settling on. This took my unit from a 107 swing weight to 112. The second weight setup was half-gram tungsten tape covering the entire sides of the paddle and slightly into the bottom corners. This took the swing weight from 110 to 113. Honestly, I don't really think there was a big difference between the playability of these setups. If anything, I don't really know that it needs weight near the throat like in the second setup. It's already such a stable paddle that you really don't do much by increasing the twist weight in that area. So adding 3 grams near the head just allows the paddle to plow through the ball better. Honestly, I could even see doing close to 12 grams in that same spot if you wanted even more power out of this paddle. All right, now we need to talk about what these paddles have in common, because they have way more things in common than they don't. Sweet spot across all models is very large, especially for a hybrid paddle. I would put this in the oversized sweet spot category. Of course, keep in mind, if you don't usually play a hybrid paddle, you may not find it as large as it's being described. A lot of people are very used to hitting the ball in certain areas based on the shape that they play. Elongated users might find that they're hitting near the tip too often, and that will make the sweet spot feel worse than it actually is. But if you play hybrids and are used to hitting that location, I think you'll find that it has a very solid sweet spot. Hand speed is great across the board. These paddles are both low in swing weight as well as balance point. So unless you're someone who's used to incredibly low static and low swing weight paddles, these should be great for most people out there. All of the models have adequate levels of power, in the same realm as the 11624 Power Series, which is in the lower end of the power spectrum. There may be some subtle differences in pop depending on the facing layer that each paddle has, but not enough to completely shift the category that the paddle plays in. Similar to the 11624 Power Series, one of the things that makes these so compelling is their ability to be offensive without giving up all of your control. For the power that these give, you still have a very forgiving paddle that is easier than most power paddles to control. And then the last thing I'll say is, across all the units that I tested, I did not experience any break-in that was significant enough to notice. The most heavily used paddle was our pre-production J2NF starting in early June, and we compared it side by side with the production model and didn't notice any changes. Spin across all models was top tier as well. All of them had results over 2100 RPM, which is on the higher side for me. All right, now with all of that out of the way, let's talk about how the NF and FC Plus compare to each other. On paper, the differences are that the FC Plus has the standard Gen 3 foam ring and 3 layers of carbon fiber, while the NF has the notched foam design and a carbon fiber, fiberglass, carbon fiber face layout. The fiberglass alone should make the paddles play quite different, but for some reason here, it isn't nearly as drastic as you'd expect. In fact, they're so similar that I decided to do a blind test 3 times with these paddles. I would go through a whole gamut of testing at the kitchen, the baseline, mid-court, and then swap between the paddles to see if I could tell the difference. All 3 times I was successful in figuring out which was which, but you guys have to remember that I literally hit paddles for a living, and my job is basically to pick apart these tiny differences. If I had to break it down for someone, the main difference that I picked up on is that at the kitchen line, the NF feels a bit stiffer and more jumpy off the face when you're in a hand battle. The FC Plus, because of the lack of fiberglass, feels less jumpy and a little easier to control at the net. People who like to take bigger full swings on a lot of strokes would probably prefer the FC Plus by a small amount. So to me, it boils down to, if you want to have a slightly less stiff feel and slightly more control, go FC Plus. If you want a slightly stiffer with a little, emphasis on a little, extra pop, do the NF. Now, really quick, I am gonna throw in the NFK and NFT in this video. However, I think most people should probably just choose the NF or FC Plus. The differences here are, yet again, subtle, because we're just talking about different face layer changes. The NFT, which is the one with the polyester face on it, has a slightly more plush feel than the FC Plus, but again, we're talking very marginally. The NFK, which is the Kevlar model, sits somewhere between the NFT and NF. It's not quite as plush as the NFT, but not as stiff as the NF either. It's a pretty middle-of-the-road neutral feel. Solid feedback, but there really wasn't anything about this model that stood out to me in a way that would make me recommend this over the already existing FC Plus or NF. Again, the differences are largely going to come down to how you want the paddle to feel when you hit the ball. There may be some subtle differences when it comes to pop on the NFT versus something like the NF, but it isn't so substantial that I would put them in entirely different categories of paddles. And that's why I think Honolulu releasing all 4 of these is a mistake. Sure, having options is nice, but sometimes too many options, especially when so similar, just causes confusion and makes making a decision even harder than it needs to be. Now I'm going to throw in the CRBN2 True Foam as a comparison in this video. Because I've mained it for around 7 to 8 months, and this is one of the first foam competitors to really convince me that it might be better than the carbon. The first thing I'm gonna say is, if you already own a True Foam, I wouldn't feel massive pressure to switch. While I do think that the NF is probably better overall for more people, I think that the True Foam is still a great paddle and has some benefits that people might prefer to this series of paddles. If you have a Carbon 2 and have it weighted up, you know how big of a difference that can make for the paddle's playability. In my opinion, that setup puts it in a similar range of pop and power as the NF. The main downside that the Genesis still has at that point is that it's both higher in static and swing weight relative to the NF. So if you wanted similar amounts of pop and power, the NF does that in a lower stock swing weight. But I think if you're hoping for a pure power and pop upgrade from a weighted Carbon 2, you might not see as big of a jump as you're hoping. Where I think one of the biggest upgrades comes for the NF is the sweet spot. In stock form, the Carbon 2 has an okay sweet spot. It has some areas that are more dead, but nothing that completely kills the paddle. And with weight, I do think that's remedied a bit, but even with that, I still don't think it compares to the J2 shape that Honolulu has with this NF line. So in my opinion, Honolulu takes the cake for sweet spot, particularly since the NF isn't using a fiberglass patch for the sweet spot and is instead using a full fiberglass sheet. While it never bothered me that much with the carbon, there were definitely times where I would hit a block or a counter dead center and just send the ball flying more than I was expecting. With the NF, that isn't an issue I've experienced at all. So the advantages that the NF has over the True Foam out of the box are: it's lower in swing weight, has better performance right out of the box, it has a larger sweet spot, and more consistent play. However, there are areas of the True Foam that certain play styles might just prefer, such as it has a bouncy feel off the sweet spot that might be preferred to the slightly more rigid feel of the NF. The carbon is also a paddle where you don't get a ton of feedback when hitting the ball, which could be preferred by some. Out of the box, the True Foam falls closer to the all-court spectrum of paddles, and that might just be what some of you want. Not everyone needs a more powerful paddle, and I think it's good that the Genesis fills some of that area in the market. The last advantage is that the True Foams come in more shapes. They have 2 elongated shapes, one with a shorter handle and one with a longer, and they also have the wide body and the upcoming hybrid. So if shape options are important, that heavily limits what you could choose with Honolulu. They might make different shapes at some point for the NF series, but it's unclear when that might happen. But anyways, that's my comparison between the J2NF and the Carbon 2 True Foam. Now let's wrap everything up. Of all the paddles we've seen in 2025 so far, I do think that these are some of the most complete paddles money can buy. And here are the reasons why. 1, the full foam core design. As we've seen with the True Foam this year, it has held up much better than the Gen 3 designed paddles on the market. So you're getting great levels of pop and power, but with increased longevity of the paddle and not having to worry about warranties as much. Of course, the NF is using a different design than what we've seen before, but if you watch the teardowns from John Q and Pickleball Medicine, these seem to be holding up very well. 2, they play fantastic out of the box even without needing to customize. A lot of paddles often need weight to bring out their full performance. Not only that, but the specs leave a lot of wiggle room for you to customize them if you do want to do that. And then number 3, I think they're in a great zone by being in the lower portion of the power category. By not going to the absolute extremes of pop and power, this makes them more playable for more people. Yes, pure power paddles like the Yola Pro 4 and Body Helix F1 are very fun, but they usually aren't best for most people's games. There's nothing wrong with the higher power paddles, and I think they're needed in the market, but I also believe that most people just don't need that much. But just remember, as awesome and well-rounded as the NF is, there really is no single best paddle on the market. This sport is very unique in that every player has a set of needs and wants, and no matter how great a paddle is overall, that does not mean it beats every paddle on the market. This is a paddle that I anticipate is going to have a lot of hype behind it, and I think it's really important as you watch reviews like this to understand the reason it has the hype. In this case, it's not because it wipes the floor with every paddle on the market and nothing can compare. Instead, what makes it special is that it has very little weaknesses and doesn't come at the premium $280 plus price range that some of the other top tier paddles are going for. Plus, you combine that with the durability that foam has shown, and you've got a really awesome combo for a paddle. So it kind of has everything that a lot of people in the market are looking for and wraps it up with a reasonable price. But just in case you're on the fence, here are the 4 reasons that I could come up with that someone might not want the NF. 1, people who traditionally don't like hybrids. 2, people who want elite levels of power like a Yola Pro 4. 3, people who want longer handles for their two-handed backhand, and 4, players who are playing in UPA qualifier events. These paddles are not UPA certified. If you fall into one or multiple of those buckets, then the new Honolulu foam core paddles may not be for you. But for everyone else, I think this is one of those paddles that nails the sweet spot of price and performance. I recently got second place in a 5-0 plus Moneyball playing with it, and it held up great. Me and my partner managed to take down a team that we should probably never beat, and if you want to see my reaction to that match, you can see it here. This is a paddle that I am considering as my main, and once I finish testing paddles like the Carbon True Foam 4 and Gearbox GX2 Power, that is likely when I'll decide which one I'm going to be maining. Now, the last thing I'll say is that if you own one of the more premium tier paddles right now, then I don't think that you need to consider upgrading. If you own something like an 11.6 24 Power Series, SLK Era Power, Yola Pro 4, Proton Flamingo, Franklin C45, or any of those style of paddles that have been really popular lately, then I would say just stick with it. The performance of all of those paddles are very good, just like the NF. I think who these paddles are going to be the most compelling for are people who are in the market for a new paddle and want something that isn't going to break the bank. So anyways, hope that helps you decide whether or not this is right for you, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.